So we're on 2.14, which is the honest tradesman. To the eyes of Mr. Jeremiah Cruncher, sitting on his stool in Fleet Street with his grizzly urchin beside him. So old Jerry Cruncher and his son are, sitting in their usual spot outside Tellson's Bank. A vast number and variety of objects and movements were every day presented. Who could sit upon anything in Fleet Street during the busy hours of the day and not be dazed and deafened by the two immense processions, one ever tending westward with the sun, and the other ever tending eastward from the sun, both ever tending to the plains beyond the range of red and purple when the sun goes down? With his straw in his mouth, Mr. Cruncher sat watching the two streams like the heathen rustic who has for several centuries been on duty watching one stream, saving that Jerry had no expectation of their ever running dry. Nor would it have been an expectation of a hopeful kind, since a small part of his income was derived from the pilotage of timid women, mostly of a full habit and past the middle term of life, from Tellson's side of the tides to the opposite shore. Brief as such companionship was in every separate instance, Mr. Cruncher never failed to become so interested in the lady as to express a strong desire to have the honor of drinking her very good health. And it was from the gifts bestowed upon him toward the execution of his benevolent purpose that he recruited his finances, as just now observed. Time was when a poet sat upon a stool in a public place and mused in the sight of men. Mr. Cruncher, sitting on a stool in a public place, but not being a poet, mused as little as possible and looked about him. It fell out that he was thus engaged in a season when crowds were few and thus belated women few, and when his affairs in general were so unprosperous as to awaken a strong suspicion in his breast that Mrs. Cruncher must have been flopping in some other pointed manner, when an unusual concourse pouring down Fleet Street westward attracted his attention. Looking that way, Mr. Cruncher made out that it was some kind of funeral coming along, and that there was a popular objection to this funeral which engendered uproar. Young Jerry, said Mr. Cruncher, turning to his offspring, it's a burying. So, it's a funeral procession, but then also it is a mob that's attacking the funeral procession, and we'll find out why in a second. Hurrah, father, cried young Jerry. The young gentleman uttered this exultant sound with mysterious significance. The elder gentleman took the cry so ill that he watched his opportunity and smote the young gentleman on the ear. So old Jerry smacks young Jerry across the face for screaming, it's a burial, which will make sense in a little bit. What do you mean? What are you hurrahing at? What do you want to convey to your own father, you young rip? This boy is getting too many for me, said Mr. Cruncher, surveying him. Him and his horrors. Don't let me hear no more of you, or you shall feel some more of me. Do you hear? I weren't doing no harm, young Jerry protested, rubbing his cheek. Drop it then, said Mr. Cruncher. I won't have none of your no harms. Get atop of that there seat and look at the crowd. His son obeyed, and the crowd approached. They were bawling and hissing round a dingy hearse and a dingy mourning coach, in which mourning coach there was only one mourner. So there's only actually one person attending the funeral, and everybody else is attacking the funeral procession. The position appeared by no means to please him. However, with an increasing rabble sounding the coach, deriding him, making grimaces at him, and incessantly groaning and calling out, "Yah, spies, tist, yaha, spies," with many compliments, too numerous and forcible to repeat. Funerals, this is important, funerals had at all times a remarkable attraction to Mr. Cruncher. He always pricked up his senses and became excited when a funeral passed Tellson's. Naturally, therefore, a funeral with this uncommon attendance excited him greatly, and he asked of the first man who ran against him, "What is it, brother? What's it about?" "I don't know," said the man. "Spies, yaha, tist, spies." He asked another man, "Who is it?" "I don't know," returned the man, clapping his hands to his mouth nevertheless, and vociferating in surprising heat, and with the greatest ardor, "Spies, yaha, tist, spies." So one of the people that has been killed is a spy, and that's why everybody is attacking the funeral. At length, a person better informed on the merits of the case tumbled against him, and from this person he learned that this funeral was the funeral of one Roger Cly. Think about where you've heard that name before. How do we know that person? Was he a spy? Asked Mr. Cruncher. Old Bailey spy, returned the informant. Yaha, tist, yaha, Old Bailey spies. Why, to be sure, exclaimed Jerry, recalling the trial at which he had assisted. I've seen him before. Dead, is he? Dead as mutton, returned the other. And you can't be too dead. Have him out there, spies. Pull him out there, spies. The idea was so acceptable, in the prevalent absence of any idea, that the crowd caught it up with eagerness and loudly repeated the suggestion to have him out and to pull him out. On the crowd's opening the coach doors, the one mourner scuffled out for himself and was in his hands for a moment, but he was so alert and made such a good use of his time that in another moment he was scouring away up a by-street after shedding his cloak, hat, long hatband, white pocket handkerchief, and other symbolical tears. These the people tore to pieces and scattered far and wide with great enjoyment, while the tradesmen hurriedly shut up their shops, for a crowd in those times stopped at nothing, and was a monster much dreaded. They had already got the length of opening the hearse to take the coffin out, when some brighter genius proposed, instead, its being escorted to its destination amidst general rejoicing. Practical suggestions being much needed, this suggestion too was received with acclamation, and the coach was immediately filled with 8 inside and out, while as many people got on the roof of the hearse as by any exercise of ingenuity stuck upon it. Among the first of these volunteers was Jerry Cruncher himself, who modestly concealed his spiky head from the observation of Tellson's in the further corner of the mourning coach. So everybody's jumping onto this, like hearse carriage equivalent. Let's see. The officiating undertakers made some protest against these changes in the ceremonies, but the river being alarmingly near, and several voices remarking on their efficacy of cold immersion in bringing refractory members of the profession to reason, the protest was faint and brief. The remodeled procession started with a chimney sweep driving the hearse, advised by the regular driver who was perched beside him, upon close inspection for the purpose, and with a pieman who, attended by his cabinet minister, driving the mourning coach. So all of these people, jump in. Thus, with beer drinking, pipe smoking, song roaring, and infinite caricaturing of woe, the disorderly procession went its way, recruiting at every step, and all shops shutting up before it. Its destination was the old church of St. Pancras, far off in the fields. It got there in a course of time, insisted on pouring into the burial ground, finally accomplished the interment of the deceased Roger Cly in its own way, and highly in its own satisfaction. So, we've talked before about mobs and why mobs are important. This is Dickens on a small scale, setting us up for the mob that we're going to see with the storming of the Bastille and the Revolution altogether. With the peasants. So this is just like a little bit of foreshadowing of what a mob is and how they look. The fact that they're out of control, they're doing things that they wouldn't normally do, that type of thing. It says, the dead man disposed of, and the crowd being under the necessity of providing some other entertainment for itself, another brighter genius, or perhaps the same, convinced the humor of impeaching casual passer-bys as Old Bailey spies and wreaking vengeance on them. I'm just going to skip over to the next page, 152, the first real paragraph. It says, Mr. Cruncher did not assist at the closing sports, but had remained behind in the churchyard to confer and condone with the undertakers, so the people that are going to bury Roger Cly. The place had a soothing influence on him. He procured a pipe from a neighboring public house and smoked it, looking in at the railings and maturely considering the spot. Jerry, said Mr. Cruncher, apostrophizing himself in his usual way, you see that there Cly that day? You see with your own eyes that he was a young'un and a straight maiden. Having smoked his pipe out, and ruminating a little longer, he turned himself about, that he might appear before the hours of closing at his station on Tellson's. Whether his meditations on mortality had touched his liver, or whether his general health had been previously at all amiss, or whether he desired to show a little attention to an eminent man, it is not much to the purpose, as that he made a short call upon his medical advisor, a distinguished surgeon, on his way back. Does Jerry Cruncher seem like the kind of guy who is friends with surgeons, distinguished surgeons? So question that. Young Jerry relieved his father with dutiful interest and report no job in his absence. The bank closed and the agent clerks came out, the usual watch was set, and Mr. Cruncher and his son went home to tea. Now, I'll tell you where it is, said Mr. Cruncher to his wife on entering. If, as an honest tradesman, my ventures go wrong tonight, I shall make sure that you've been praying against me, and I shall work you for it, same as I seen you doing it. The dejected Mrs. Cruncher shook her head. Why, you're at it before my face, said Mr. Cruncher with signs of angry apprehension. I'm saying nothing. So this is now, he's back at his house, and he's talking to his wife, and, she prays against him, but really for him. Well then, don't meditate nothing. You might as well flop as meditate. You may as well go again me one way or another. Drop it altogether. Yes, Jerry. Yes, Jerry, repeated Mr. Cruncher, sitting down to tea. It is yes, Jerry. That's it. You may say yes, Jerry. Mr. Cruncher had no particular meaning in these sulky corroborations, but made use of them, as people not unfrequently do, to express general ironical dissatisfaction. You and your yes, Jerry, said Mr. Cruncher, taking a bite out of his bread and butter, and seeming to help it down with a large invisible oyster out of his saucer. I think so, I believe you. You're going out tonight? Asked his decent wife, when he took another bite. Yes, I am. May I go with you, father? Asked his son briskly. No, you mayn't. I'm going, as your mother knows, a-fishing. That's what I'm going to do, going a-fishing. So he says he's going fishing. We'll just keep that in the back of your mind. Your fishing rod gets rather rusty, don't it, father? Never you mind. Shall you bring any fish home, father? If I don't, you'll have short commons tomorrow, returned the gentleman, shaking his head. That's questions enough for you. I ain't going out till you've been long in bed. So, the night goes on. Young Jerry goes to bed. I'm just going to flip to when old Jerry actually goes out. So, let's see. Let's go to on 154. So the second full paragraph, it says, thus the evening wore away with the Cruncher family until young Jerry was ordered to bed, and his mother, laid under similar injunctions, obeyed them. Mr. Cruncher beguiled the earlier watches of the night with solitary pipes, and did not start upon his excursion until nearly 1 a.m. Toward the small and ghostly hour, he rose up from his chair, took a key out of his pocket, opened a lock and cupboard, and brought forth a sack, a crowbar of convenient size, a rope and a chain, and other fishing tackle of that nature. Disposing those articles about him in skillful manner, he bestowed a parting defiance on Mrs. Cruncher, extinguished the light, and went out. Young Jerry, who had only made a feign, or he pretended to undress, when he went to bed, was not long after his father. So young Jerry follows his dad out, and that's going to be the way that we see what happens. So think back to the trial with Darnay. The only way that we saw anything was through Jerry's eyes. The only way that we're going to see this whole scene is through young Jerry's eyes. Impelled by a laudable ambition to study the art and mystery of his father's honest calling, young Jerry, keeping as close to the house fronts, walls, and doorways as his eyes were close to one another, held his honored parent in view. So he's following his dad. Within half an hour from first starting, they were beyond the winking lamps and the more than winking watchmen, and were out upon a lonely road. Another fisherman was picked up here, and that so silently that if young Jerry had been superstitious, he might have supposed the second follower of the gentle craft to have, all of a sudden, split himself in two. The three went on, and young Jerry went on, until the three stopped under a bank overhanging the road. So Jerry Cruncher meets up with these other guys. In the shadow of the bank and wall, the three turned out of the road and up a blind lane, of which the wall, there risen to some 8 or 10 feet high, formed one side. Crouching down in a corner, peeping up the lane, the next object that young Jerry saw was the form of his honored parent, so Jerry Cruncher, pretty well defined against a watery and clouded moon, nimbly scaling an iron gate. He was soon over, and then the second fisherman got over, and then the third. They all dropped softly on the ground within the gate, and lay there a little, listening perhaps. Then they moved away on their hands and knees. So thinking about where he gets the rust, so the iron gate. It was now young Jerry's turn to approach the gate, which he did, holding his breath. Crouching down again in a corner there and looking in, he made out the three fishermen creeping through some rank grass and all the gravestones in the churchyard. It was a churchyard that they were in, looking on like ghosts in white, while the church tower itself looked on like a ghost of a monstrous giant. They did not creep far before they stopped and stood upright, and then began to fish. So, he's in a graveyard. That explains the muddy boots. We just said, we've explained the rusty hands. Pay attention to this, because obviously you can't go fishing in a graveyard, literally. So they fished with a shovel at first. Presently the honored parent appeared to be adjusting some instrument like a great corkscrew. Whatever tools they worked with, they worked hard until the awful striking of the church clock so terrified young Jerry that he made off with his hair as stiff as his father. So, what are they doing? What are they actually fishing for? Young Jerry gets afraid, and so he runs away. It says, but his long-cherished desire to know more about these matters not only stopped him in his running away, but lured him back again. So he runs away, so he misses some of it, but then he comes back. They were still fishing perseveringly when he peeped in at the gate for the second time, but now they seemed to have got a bite. They were screwing and there was a screwing and complaining sound down below, and their bent figures were constrained as if by a weight. By slow degrees, the weight broke away the earth upon it and came to the surface. Young Jerry very well knew what it would be, but when he saw it and saw his honored parent about to wrench it open, the coffin, he was so frightened, being new to the sight, that he made off again and never stopped until he had run a mile or more. So he sees enough to see his dad exhume a coffin, but then he doesn't see anything else, and that's really important. He would not have stopped then for anything less necessary than breath, it being a spectral sort of race that he ran, and one highly desirable to get to the end of. He had a strong idea that the coffin he had seen was running after him, so he has this, scary, not dream, but daydream that the coffin is chasing him. So he runs all the way back to his house and goes upstairs and goes on his bed. So in the middle of 156 it says, from his oppressed slumber, young Jerry in his closet was awakened, so now it's morning, after daybreak and before sunrise by the presence of his father in the family room. Something had gone wrong with him, at least, so young Jerry inferred, from the circumstance of his holding Mrs. Cruncher by the ears and knocking the back of her head against the headboard of the bed. I told you I would, said Mr. Cruncher, and I did. Jerry, 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 his wife implored. You oppose yourself to the profit of the business, said Jerry, and me and my partners suffer. You was to honor and obey. Why the devil don't you? I try to be a good wife, Jerry, the poor woman protested with tears. Is it being a good wife to oppose your husband's business? Is it honoring your husband to dishonor his business? It is disobeying your husband to disobey him on the little subject of his business? You hadn't taken to the dreadful business then, Jerry. It's enough for you, retorted Mr. Cruncher, to be the wife of an honest tradesman and not to occupy your female mind with calculations when he took to his trade or when he didn't. An honoring and obeying wife would let his trade alone altogether. Call yourself a religious woman? If you're a religious woman, give me an irreligious one. You have no more natural sense of duty than the bed of this here Thames River has of a pile, and similarly it must be knocked into you. The altercation was conducted in a low tone of voice and terminated in the honest tradesman's kicking off his clay-soiled boots and laying down at the length of the floor. After taking a timid peep at him lying on his back with his rusty hands under his head for a pillow, his son lay down too and fell asleep again. There were no fish for breakfast, and not much of anything else. Mr. Cruncher was out of spirits and out of temper, and kept an iron pot lid by him as a projectile for the correction of Mrs. Cruncher in case she should observe any symptoms of her saying grace. He was brushed and washed at the usual hour and set off with his son to pursue his ostensible calling. So, why is Jerry so mad? And it has to do with what young Jerry didn't see. So what would have happened in the time that young Jerry ran off and regular Jerry was back at the graveyard if there were no fish for breakfast? What does that mean? Young Jerry, walking with a stool under his arm at his father's side along sunny and crowded Fleet Street, was a very different young Jerry from him of the previous night, running home through darkness and solitude from his grim pursuer. His cunning was fresh with the day, and his qualms were gone with the night, in which particular it is not improbable that he had compeers in Fleet Street and the city of London that fine morning. Father, said young Jerry as they walked along, taking care to keep at arm's length and to have the stool well between them, what's a resurrection, man? Mr. Cruncher came to a stop on the pavement before he answered. How should I know? I thought you knowed everything, father, said the artless boy. Well, returned Mr. Cruncher, going on again, and lifting off his hat to give his spikes free play. He's a tradesman. What's his goods, father? asked young Jerry. His goods, says Mr. Cruncher, after turning it over in his mind, is a branch of scientific goods. persons' bodies, ain't it, Father?" asked the lively boy. "I believe it's something of that sort," said Mr. Cruncher. "Oh, Father, I should like to be a resurrection man when I'm quite growed up." Mr. Cruncher was soothed, but shook his head in a dubious and moral way. "It depends on how you develop your talents. Be careful to develop your talents, and never to say no more than you can help to anybody, and there's no telling at the present time what you may not come to be fit for." As young Jerry, thus engaged, went on a few yards in advance to plant his stool in the shadow of the bar, Mr. Cruncher added to himself, "Jerry, you honest tradesman, there's hope that that boy will be a blessing to you and a recompense to you for his mother." So, a couple things to know are that back then, autopsies were illegal. So scientists and doctors and surgeons would pay people like Jerry Cruncher to go and steal bodies that then they could use for science. But again, why were there no fish that morning for breakfast? Why was Jerry so mad at his wife? Be thinking about all of those things.